Well, I reckon that some leaders can do it and some leaders can't. And some of us just learn. And the it is the ability to work in multiple cultures. To cross cultures. And not just cross cultures, but thrive in crossing cultures. And I think the prize, well, you may be a leader because you want to maintain things and make them the same. In which case, you might as well leave now, I'm boring. I'm a leader because I want to change things. And I think if you want to change things, you're almost certainly addressing big problems. And they're usually big problems that squelch and ooze and splooch, and they have no respect for boundaries. Yeah? They ooze across boundaries. The thing that frustrates me is that most leaders learn to lead within their boundaries. Within the boundaries of their business card, or of their pips, or of their stilettos. Yeah? And actually, if you want to be a leader who cracks the difficult problems, you have to learn to lead across boundaries. Whether that's my passion, certainly, whether that's because you're a citizen or whether that's because you're a professional. I was in Whitehall yesterday evening, lockdown, but I was remembering years ago being invited to, somebody phoned me up one evening and said, would you come tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, Julia, for a meeting about gun crime? And you know, when governments phone you up and ask you, you sort of, they assume that you immediately will say yes. And I said, well, of course, I know absolutely nothing on the subject of gun crime. And they said, never mind, turn up, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Pitched up. The secret to this story is I'm now 58, and I reckon I was about 55 at this time when they asked me. And I walked in and I thought, you know, I've had enough of complete waste of time meetings. Because the meeting was full of nothing but people from the police. Now, there's one thing I know, which is that you cannot solve gun crime with only people from the police. You need people from the schools, people from housing, you need bankers, you need retailers, you need people from government, you need people from Oxfam, from IBM, from whatever. Nothing, you know, real problems can't be solved by just groups on their own. And at work, you know, the days when you could solve a problem of an organisation with marketing alone, I don't know if they ever existed, but they certainly don't exist nowadays. You have to get production to work with marketing, to work with sales, to work with all kinds of different pieces. And then you've got to work with people on the other side of the world. And constantly you are forced to work with people who are not like you. Now, do you remember, for those of you who've got kids, do you remember IQ? You remember IQ when you were at school and everybody told you it was just, that was the trick. Be clever. And do you remember when you had small kids and they were about 6 months old and you told everybody that this was the most intelligent child the world had ever seen, based on no information whatsoever? Yeah? Just because they had to, they got your genes. And, you know, IQ is extraordinarily useful, and it means you can crack information relatively quickly, which in the modern day is quite useful. But on the whole, it isn't enough. And if I had a penny for all the idiots who say, you know, if you could just take the people out of this problem, there wouldn't be a problem, and you sort of think, what a jerk. You know, leadership, yes, just take the people out, no problem. But you had an IQ, and then you had EQ. That was interesting. It was a move in the right direction, a recognition that human beings were involved in leadership. But again, if I had a penny for all the idiots who say, I have EQ, I'm good with people. And they always forget those two extra words, like me. Yeah? I'm good with people who are like me. Now, I believe the future will be, are you any good with people who are not like you? Because if you're not good with people who are not like you, you won't crack the big problems, you won't come up with the new ideas. And actually, I don't think you'll ever be any good as a leader in the world of the great cities of the world where all the cultures of the world collide. In the great cities of the world, cultures are constantly colliding. And at that point of collision, there's usually a leader. And the best of the leaders turn the collision into a spark. And the worst of the leaders turn their collision into a complete crash. So how do we as leaders develop what I would call the cultural intelligence to lead people who are not like us, CQ? And some time ago, can't remember when, I decided I would wander around the world and go and see people I thought were slightly better than me or us or all of us at crossing divides. Now, wait a minute, just hold on for a minute. When I say cultural intelligence, I mean crossing cultures. I mean geographies, generations, backgrounds, beliefs, sectors, and specialisms. Yeah, geographies, self-evident. Generations. Think how many people of my age ought to have in their competencies. Can you inspire people half your age? And think how many people in the world ought to have, when they're in their early 20s, in their competencies. Can you influence people double your age? Generations is quite as wicked as geographies. Specialisms, sectors, you know, I'm an idiot. I work for the NGO world, so therefore I probably can't add 2 and 2 together. Most of you are shits making money for shareholders. And then there are people down the river who are working for government, which means they're wasting public money. Well, actually, most problems can't be solved unless you get the 3 sectors working together. Most big problems. And those ideas don't, it's pretty old-fashioned. The other one, it's interesting, isn't it? I got a promotion recently, a very, very big promotion. I became a mother-in-law. I became an Indian mother-in-law, actually. My son married somebody from Bangalore. And it's really interesting, you know. Occasionally, Megha and I clash. And is it anything to do with the fact that she was born thousands of miles away from me? No. Is it anything to do with the fact that she has brown skin and I have white skin? No. Has it got anything to do with the fact that she's half my age? No. Has it got something to do with the fact that she's a lawyer and I'm an entrepreneur? Hell yes. She had the wedding sorted in 10-minute slots. Yeah? I reckoned it would all be fine. You know, geographies, generations, sectors, specialisms, backgrounds, beliefs, all sectors, right, all cultures. So I wandered around and went and talked to lots of people about how did you develop cultural intelligence, right? And I came up with the most pathetic solution you've ever seen. And given that you're all MBAs from Exeter, you're probably extraordinarily clever and will rip this proposition to pieces in seconds. So hold back, right? Be nice, just for a minute. And remember that sometimes oversimplification can be useful. And I would propose to you that what I'm going to offer you is merely a way of having the conversations that most of us duck. And only by having those conversations will you develop cultural intelligence. Okay? So live with it. There's a slide here that somebody's got. Nicola. So let's play with it anyhow. Right. So you and I are here, right? We're this person here, right? And this is, okay, remember, oversimplistic, that people with cultural intelligence have worked this one out, right? What are the things that are core to you that if you stop doing it, you would no longer be you? Yeah? And I don't mean values. I mean everything. Everything from values to beliefs to your behaviors. What are the things that are fundamentally you, and what's your flex, the stuff you can move on? And that's not fundamentally you. And I would suggest that leaders, the stronger your core is, the more people trust you. And the more flexible your flex is, the more people trust you. Hold with me for a few more minutes, all right? And that cultural intelligence comes on that line between the two. A few more minutes. Then you can go from me. So you meet people who are like that. Yeah? This one. Yeah? Huge, huge core. And a tiny, 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 tiny little flex. Yes? That's my grandparents. They lived on the Tongmoor Road, which is in Bolton in Manchester, just off the Tongmoor Road, in Bradshaw. And they took the view that everybody in their street ought to be like them, and that if they weren't, there was something wrong with them. But if they were like them, there wouldn't be a problem. Yeah? And I love them dearly, but you couldn't let them out the front door. Yeah? I'm sure you never met anybody like that. And then you get people who are like this. Yeah? A tiny, 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 tiny little core. And this huge cavernous flex. Now, that was my first boss, right? He was a salesman and I was sent out with him. And I used to sit there and think, is there anything this guy wouldn't say to get a deal? And you wouldn't trust him further than you can throw him. And I think that cultural intelligence does come on this line. Now, a stupid example, okay? So I got this email from somebody who said to me, it helped a lot. And I said, tell me. And he said, I've stopped spitting in the street. And so I said, explain. And he said, I've realized that with some people, if I spit in the street, they will never get over it and never take me seriously at all. And I've also realized that I can still be myself and stop spitting in the street. Am I making sense? My favorite one, okay? My favorite one. My favorite one was going to work in Jeddah, which, as you know, is the port cities are much more interesting. It's the port city of Saudi. It's not Riyadh. And there's a women's university there called AFAT College. And I was going to go and work at AFAT College for a while, short time. And they said to me, I would be much more effective if I covered myself. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And in the middle of thinking about this, I got a sort of delegation of daughters, right? I've got a lot of kids, and the three middle ones are girls. And the three girls arrived one evening to give me a lecture. Mum, you've been a women's lib all your life. How could you even for a minute consider the concept of covering yourself? This would be a disgraceful thing to do. So I listened diligently, like we do to our children, and then you don't always do what they tell you to do, but you listen. And I decided in the end that I have always taken the view that what I wear is in my flex. Self-evident, right? And so I said, well, if it is in my flex, I need to stick with that. So I covered myself. I'm sure you've all done it. You know, you fly into Saudi space, you go into that queue of women going to the loo, you go into the loo, you come back out all covered, you go. And the thing that was fascinating, the first one was to discover that I had this view inside me that I'd never quite been aware of, that was based on prejudgment rather than judgment, that all women who covered themselves were pathetic. I don't know where that view came from, but certainly I held it. And believe me, if you spend a whole week with powerful women at AFAT College in Jeddah who cover themselves, you can't really maintain that prejudice for very long. You realize what a dumb view it was. And then the thing that was really fascinating was to come back to London. And then people would say to you, you see? And you go, yeah. And you see they, and you know you're always in trouble when the sentence starts with they. You, Julia, are prepared to go to Jeddah and cover yourself. They come to London and will not wear Western clothes. To which my answer is, what I wear is in my flex, and what the women I worked with in Jeddah wore was in their core. And actually, seen through that, it was a perfectly idiotic story. My interest was that actually, that cultural intelligence does lie on that line, and that as you proceed through life, the line moves a bit. It should move with enormous care, but move it should. And if it isn't moving, it's probably that you're being a wimp and just sitting nicely in your own space, convinced of your own rightness. Check, who do you follow on Twitter? Do you follow people on Twitter you agree with? Or do you follow people on Twitter you don't agree with? They're much more interesting. And that I think that, you know, if I look at me, I would say I had a pretty big core at the beginning. I adored my father. Anything he did was right. I just acquired his core, you know, as one thing, packaged. I went down to a tiny core. I would argue it's quite important as a teenager to have no core whatsoever, and to make the most appalling mistakes. I think it moves around when you take your first job. I think it moves around when you have your first team of people who are completely different from you. I think actually I learned a lot when I suddenly ran a team of people who were older than me, certainly people who came from around the world. My core reflex was completely blown all over the place when I had teenage children who ask you all kinds of questions to which you don't want to have to answer at all. And you slowly begin to realize that they don't have the same core as you. And I reckon if you don't learn that quick enough, you've lost your kids by 20. And then you slowly discover that nobody's ever going to have the same core as you. And then you get to 58, and it starts creeping up. Yeah, because you become convinced you know the answer to everything, and you spend your whole life ramming it back down again to something that it should be. And that you proceed in life, and this moves. And in it, sometimes you find these knots in your core, the things you didn't know were there, those things that you suddenly realize that aren't based on judgment, they're based on prejudgment. They're pretty horrible things to find that you believe. And I think it's quite interesting then, you've got a choice here when you find them. You either move them to your flex, you dust them down, you give them a good airing and you move them to your flex. Or they're so built into your DNA, you can't move them. But in which case you're going to have to understand them and make sure that they're your problem and not somebody else's. If that makes sense too. And they're horrible. But then, well, put it this way. When I was writing the book, I became really interested that most people thought that I acquire cultural intelligence if I can persuade you and you and you and you to give me information. Yeah? The more I understand about your culture, the more I'll get cultural intelligence. The more exposure I have to other cultures, the more my cultural intelligence goes up. And though that is indeed completely true, I think there's a killer culture There's the murderous killer culture that catches you every single time, and that is your own culture. And it's understanding your own culture, and when that culture makes you more open to understanding things, and when it makes you blind to things. When it allows you to understand the core, and when it doesn't allow you to understand the core. But that most of the cultural intelligence came from understanding where your own culture got in the way or not. But ultimately, the whole thing only really becomes of any use when you're dealing with other people. Yeah? Or other brands. This is your organization that you work in, and this is you. Yeah? And you start working it. Now, get an example. We're both in Flex. Yeah? Really easy. Both happily in Flex. We needn't worry at all. Culture's no problem at all. Sometimes you just misread it a bit. Forgive me for all the men in the audience. I love men. I married one. And I love him dearly. But to all the women in the audience, think of those dinners you occasionally go to, yeah? Where some jerk stands up after supper and starts his speech by saying, "Do you mind if I make a slightly sexist joke?" You know, confidently knowing that we're all in Flex. Yeah? And you sit there thinking, what a jerk. He's absolutely guessed it wrong. And I won't say anything, but I will personally think he's a jerk. In fact, the other day, I was wonderful. It was a panel, right? And there was this guy here, and he turned to me, and he said, "Mrs. Middleton, do you mind if when I introduce you, I make a slightly sexist joke?" So I looked to the guy who was speaking next to me, and I turned to him and I said, "Do you mind if when he introduces you, he makes a slightly racist joke?" Because the guy was black. It was wonderful. He was dead. But, you know, sometimes you misjudge it. We're all in Flex, aren't we? Well, hell, we're not, you know. Or sometimes we're both in core and it's clashing. Yeah? Is it really clashing? If I don't mention the organisation, then I won't get in trouble. But the other day, I was in a very big professional services firm, and a very senior partner, woman, said exactly as follows, and I promise you this is exactly as follows. "The guy who works for me is Muslim. He refuses to shake my hand. Therefore, he shows he has no respect for me. And therefore, I'll never take him to any client meetings." You thought, ooh, that's bold. But the truth is, are you sure this is clashing core? Are you sure he's showing lack of respect? Or actually, in his culture, is he actually showing enormous respect? Yeah? So sometimes I think you see clashing cores, and it's actually not, you're not necessarily interpreting it right. And then sometimes you have these enormous clashing cores. And that's interesting. I was brought up French, and I never understood the British. The British are completely beyond me. Occasionally my colleagues say, "You don't like him." And I said, "Why don't I like him?" And they say, "Well, you had an argument with him." And I said, "Well, what's that got to do with it?" It's perfectly possible to have an argument with somebody and disagree with them and still get on with them. And I'm fascinated with the amount of times people say there's clashing cores. The answer is, you're never going to find anybody with the same core as you, so you're always going to clash at some stage. So why don't you get on with it? And get on with disagreeing. That doesn't actually mean you have to clash. And then sometimes you really are clashing cores. And in which case, frankly, you've got a decision to make. But this oversimplistic model for me has allowed a lot of conversations that that are quite tricky. And got my way through quite a lot of conversations. It is the conversations that reveal your own culture and other people's cultures, and I think develop the ability to cross boundaries. And if you don't develop it, I don't think you'll have any good ideas. I deeply, deeply believe that the secret of innovation is well-led discord. And leaders without cultural intelligence cannot deliver well-led discord. So without the cultural intelligence, I think you're doomed to having the same ideas all the time, which frankly is a bit of a problem in the modern world. Two, I think the great cities of the world will have many cultures clashing, and if you want to stay in your own culture, I think you sort of knock yourself out of the ability to lead in the great cities of the world. My eldest son runs all the operating theatres at the Royal London. Yeah, she's just over here. He always tells me, I don't believe him quite, he says, you know, if I try and get it to work as well as I possibly can, I get all the project management, I get all of it as well as I possibly can. The truth is that the footfall through these operating theatres are of cultures who have completely different attitudes to life and death. And if I don't understand that, I can never really make this place work properly. There's almost no job where you aren't dealing with clashing cultures. And I think as a leader who wants to deal with the big problems of the world, you need to develop cultural intelligence, and I wish you well. Thank you.